Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Ken Sorenson. I'm a retired high school and junior college history and English professor, and I get the glorious opportunity of coming into wonderful venues all over the valley and sharing thoughts and ideas and historical scenarios with you. Joe's been kind enough to invite me in today and to help share with you some thoughts on December, the month of December, and specifically the events day to day. What happened throughout that month historically? And just there is some very unique events, and some of them we're very familiar with and you will recognize, and some of them are birthdays or death days or historical things that are quite unique. And anyway, let's go ahead and get started and find out about the month of December. This one is a very good one to start with. It all started on a bus. It started on a Friday afternoon on December the 1st, 1955. And here we have a picture of Rosa Parks. And Rosa Parks had lived all of her life there in Alabama. And she had grown up, and she was by this time married. She had children. She was working outside the home and just simply trying to help the household survive. And she was caring for other families in their homes and doing all kinds of good things with and for them. And it was now the end of the week. And she wanted to go home like everybody wanted to go home. And so she stood in line and waiting for the bus to come, because nobody had vehicles. And so she's just waiting for the bus. It's about 6:30 in the evening, and the bus pulls over, and she goes to get on the bus. When she gets on the bus, and you need to remember there in the South in the mid-50s, and even after that for quite a while, when you get onto a bus, there's going to be very distinctive differences. Obviously, it's going to have a long corridor, and it's going to have seats on each side, bench seats on each side. And about halfway through, there's going to be a big white line. And this white line is going to be painted on the floor of the bus. It's going to be painted on the walls and the overhead. And everybody knows what that white line means. That white line means where you are allowed to sit. And the white people get to sit in front of the line, and the black people sit behind the line, and never the twain shall meet. And what happens here is that she gets on the bus, pays her ticket, starts walking down the aisle. She's looking in the bus, and the bus is, the front half of the bus is almost completely empty. And from the white line back, it is jammed. It is wall-to-wall jammed with people. And there are mothers with holding babies in their arms. There are fathers with holding grocery bags. There are kids just trying to get them. It's just filled. And she starts to walk toward the back of the bus, looking. And she's hoping to find a little bitty square space that she can kind of sneak into and just hang on. And there are poles in the bus that sometimes if you can't sit down, maybe you're hoping to grab a pole to kind of steady yourself for the ride. And there is no room. And she gets to the edge of the white line, and the bus has gone on. And she turns around and sits down. And the entire back of the bus went, oh my goodness, because they know this is not going to end well. And the bus kept going. And it gets down to the next bus stop. And it pulls over, and a man gets on the bus and pays his ticket, and the bus drives on down the road, and the man starts walking down and sees there's a black woman sitting in front of the white line. What? And so he goes running up to her. You can't sit here. And she very kindly explains to him, I paid my ticket. There's no room place else to sit. And I'm not going to move until there's a place to sit. And he says, well, you can't sit here. And she wouldn't move. And so he turns around and goes running up to the front of the bus. And he gets there. and screams at the driver, "Do you know there is a black woman sitting in the white section of the bus?" And so the bus driver stops and goes running back and explains to her she's going to have to move. And she explains to him, "There is no place to move to. And I would be happy to move if you can show me where I can sit down." And she will not move. And so he gets off the bus and goes over to the payphone there in the corner. You remember when there were payphones on every corner? And goes over to the payphone on the corner and calls the police, and they come and arrest her and take her to jail for disturbing the peace. What this event does, this event begins a legal battle that within a year ends up in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court desegregates city buses and undoes the Supreme Court case of Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, and undoes all kinds of things, and allows integrated transportation in America. And it transformed our world. Now, December the 2nd, there on the screen you see two men. As you're facing the picture, the man on the right is a dentist, a retired dentist. His name is Dr. Barney Clark. The man on the left, his name, as you can see there, his name is Dr. Just lost his name, I'm sorry. Dr. William DeVries. Dr. William DeVries is the doctor in charge of opening Dr. Clark's chest and implanting a new artificial heart, because Dr. Clark's heart had been damaged. And this took place in 1968. And what happened? I'm sorry, it took place in 1982. And what happened is when that chest was opened, an artificial heart was inserted. And that artificial heart kept going for the next 112 days and allowed Dr. Clark to finish out his life to some degree. But it shows we have tremendous ability to create wonderful technology. And it did a great, great thing. December the 3rd, 1857, there was a little boy, and I'm not even going to try and pronounce his Polish name. I'm delighted that what he did is that he eventually changed his name to an English explainable name. But he was born in 1857 in Poland, and his father and his mother were well-educated people who the Russian Tsar and Tsarina looked down on because these people wanted freedom of expression. They ended up getting, the family gets banished to Siberia, and the parents end up dying. This little boy is sent away to be raised by an uncle. He eventually runs away and becomes a sea captain over his lifetime, and then he becomes eventually an author. English is his fourth language. He is known as Joseph Conrad, and he wrote a very interesting book entitled The Heart of Darkness, and just transformed literature in the process. December the 3rd, 1857 was his birthday. Now, here's another obscure individual that nobody's ever even heard of before. This man's name is William Carey. He owns a newspaper in India, of all places, and on December the 4th, 1829, he had been campaigning to try and change a cultural phenomena in India. The cultural phenomena was, and it was called suti. The cultural phenomena is when a man dies, what they do is, in order to properly send the body off to the Netherlands, wherever their culture believes, What they do is they create a big bonfire, they lay the man's deceased body down, and they start to set him on fire. The cultural requirement is then that the wife go running over to the bonfire and jump onto the bonfire and embrace the husband, and that puts her to death. And so the couple dies together and enters the heaven simultaneously. Mr. Carey decided that this is disgusting, and it is disgusting. And so he spent about a decade trying to bring about a change. And the British Empire, then in charge of India, brought about a change in that culture and no longer required the women to commit suicide upon the death of their husbands. December the 5th, 1791, an individual died in Vienna, Austria. That man's name was Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Was he kind of a big deal? Look at the screen. He produced 21 piano concertos, 5 violin concertos, 4 horn concertos, concertos for clarinet and other wind instruments, 4 symphonies, 27 string quartets, 6 string quartets, and 17 masses, including his last work, the Incomplete Requiem Mass of 1791. When he died at the age of 35, our world lost a musical genius, and he died on December the 5th in 1791. On December the 6th, 1865, a year after issuing, this is hard to even talk about, Abraham Lincoln issued the initial Emancipation Proclamation in September of 1862, and it went into effect in January of 1863. And what Lincoln did not only helped release the slaves into freedom in the slave states, but he also set up the entire focus of the Civil War to be against slavery and the freedom of the slaves. And in order to guarantee that, he began campaigning within his own party and within Congress to help bring about what eventually becomes known as the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. It passed in January of 1865 in Congress just 3 months before Lincoln was killed. As you can see, the entire amendment there printed on the screen. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, wherein the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to its jurisdiction. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. And we ended slavery. What a monumental step forward for our country. Sunday morning, December the 7th, 1941, the country of America changed. Because that country, our country, was attacked. One of our territories was Hawaii. And on that Sunday morning, all of a sudden in the horizon, planes came flying over the horizon and started dropping bombs on Pearl Harbor. Over 2,400 military personnel and 68 civilians lost their lives. Over 1,100 people were injured. 188 aircraft were destroyed, and 21 ships were damaged or sunk, 2 beyond repair, including the USS Arizona. And if you've been here in Arizona, you likely know that you can go downtown in the center of Phoenix where the government complex is at 18th Avenue and Jefferson, and you can walk those grounds and you can see the anchor from the USS Arizona that has been brought back and it is there on display in our state. This changed our world because America was strongly isolationist. You want to have a war? Have a war. Leave us alone. We don't care. Don't call us. We won't call you. Leave us alone. And we were fine with that, and all of a sudden, we were attacked on that Sunday morning. And that was on December the 7th. On Monday, December the 8th, President Franklin Roosevelt asked for and got a joint declaration of war from Congress. All Congress came and met together, both the House and the Senate met together, and this is where President Roosevelt began that speech with those immortal words, December the 7th, 1941, a day which shall live in infamy. And he goes out on and lays out the case for declaring war against Japan. And Congress voted us into war. And most of America assumed we are only going to be at war with Japan. We were going to leave Europe alone. And I will show you in just a few minutes how that changed. But that was how we got into World War II. The war had been going on for almost 2.5 years before we got involved. Did we make a difference? Just slightly. There was another event on December the 8th, but this happened in 1980. And for those of us that grew up in the 1960s and 70s, and music absolutely changed our world. It changed again in a detrimental way on December 8th, 1980. And we found out that one of the Beatles, John Lennon, while he and his wife were walking into the Dakota apartment building where they lived in New York City, was accosted by a deranged fan who came up and shot him. What is crazy about that whole story is that there was a policeman with a car fairly close by. That policeman came running up and people were screaming, and he took one look at what had happened. He knew that the ambulances couldn't get there quick enough. He lifted up John Lennon and put him in the back of the cop car and drove him to the hospital, trying to get him there quicker, with maybe a chance to help him survive. And unfortunately, it didn't work. But December the 8th was a sad day in music, rock and roll music history. December the 9th, 1886, a man was born by the name of Clarence Birdseye. Really? Well, we all grew up looking at those little boxes that were sitting in our freezer that were about this thick and about that big, and frozen peas and frozen corn and frozen vegetables and all of that. This is the guy that invented them. And he came along and figured out that you can take fresh vegetables and you can freeze them and package them and preserve them and keep them. And it's changed our world. Absolutely changed our world, and makes it so much more convenient for all of us as we go ahead and try to plan our meals. And what an incredible, incredible individual. And look down at the bottom of the slide, and it says, Birdseye then began to experiment with meats, seafood, and fruits. And in 1925, he founded the General Seafood Company, and we start getting frozen packages of seafood also. He changed our world, absolutely changed our world. December 10th, 1948. This is a picture of Eleanor Roosevelt, former First Lady. And when her husband died in April of 1945, and she walked out of, thinking she was walking away from the political world, it didn't take long for the new incoming president, then President Harry Truman, to call her and ask her to come back to the White House because he wanted to talk to her. He wanted her to help become an American representative to the brand new organization that had become known as the United Nations. And on December 10th, 1948, they brought out a document, and you're seeing her holding that document, and it's called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and trying to establish the fact that everyone who lives on the planet should have the right of clean air to breathe, of being able to have clean water to drink, of being able to have a secure environment in which to live. And this document helps establish human rights. And it's a beautiful, beautiful document. And she always said that in her mind, it was one of the greatest accomplishments of her life. This year, on December the 10th, is going to be the beginning of Hanukkah. And it fluctuates according to the calendar a little bit every year, just a few days each year. But this year it'll start on December the 10th and it'll last through December the 18th. And what it is Hanukkah is a rededication of the second temple dedication during the Maccabean revolt in the century prior to the birth of Jesus. And it is a reminder of the historical importance and culture to the Jewish people on how important it is to stand up for what they believe. And it's a beautiful representation of that belief. On December the 11th, 1620, the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock. Now, to help you understand, they had left Holland in March of that year. They had made arrangements to get on a boat to get to England, and then they're going to trade boats and take that next boat over to America. The problem with that is that the boat that they got from Holland to England, that boat wasn't very good. And they ended up having to wait there in England to get it repaired. And then they got on the other boat, and that one had problems. They didn't get to America until November the 9th. And how crazy. And then you've got to get off the boat. You've got to find out, okay, how are you going to live here? You're landing in New England in winter. We know it's darn cold in New England in winter. And where are you going to get food? Where are you going to get a place to stay? What are you going to do here? And you're going to have to not only get something immediately, you're going to have to prepare for your future. And they actually put together the Mayflower Compact and a form of government, and they decided how they were going to do this, and then they began the process by staying on land from December the 11th on. The Mayflower didn't even leave and go back to England until April to help support their efforts. And then when the Mayflower was going to leave, not one person asked to go back. It's an impressive story. Also on December the 11th, 1936, King Edward decided that he can't live without the love of his life, and he married the American divorcee. And that, since she was divorced, that made it impossible for him to marry and retain the crown of England. And he said, the woman I love is more important to me than being the King of England. And he stepped down. What that did was that brought in his brother, who ends up having a daughter who became Queen Elizabeth II. She was not in the direct line and wouldn't have been had this event not taken place. And then, on Thursday, December the 11th, 1941, there you see a picture of Hitler standing in front of the Reichstag in Berlin, asking for and getting a declaration of war against the United States. We had not planned on going to war in Europe. But once Hitler declared war on us, this is how we get into the European war. And all of a sudden, within 4 days, we are attacked and we declare war, and war is declared against us. And then we are fighting a world war on both sides of the world simultaneously. And that becomes one of the most unbelievably great accomplishments of anyone ever, because that's when the greatest generation stepped forward in American history and truly made a difference. December the 12th, 1805, a little boy was born in New England. His name was William Lloyd Garrison. Mr. Garrison grew up and got into the newspaper industry. And Mr. Garrison, it turned out, became one of the staunchest advocates against slavery ever. And his newspaper is called The Liberator. And he starts campaigning and never does let go of the concept that slavery is illegal and immoral and not something that a Christian country should even consider having anywhere in its boundaries. And he was a magnificent voice forever, and he did get to live to see beyond the Civil War, and he got to see the end of slavery in America. On December the 12th, 1901, there was a very interesting meeting that took place just off the coast of Newfoundland in Canada. And it was a very cold, wet, windy day, and 3 guys were standing out there, and one of them was named Marconi. And Marconi his friend had a kite that was up in the air, and it was holding wire. And what Marconi did on that day was received from England the first transcontinental radio message across the Atlantic Ocean. And that took place on December the 12th, 1901. On December the 13th, 1835, a man by the name of Philip Brooks was born. Now, Brooks, from our perspective, really doesn't occupy a great position in history. He was an American religious figure, and those who knew him highly respected him. However, one year at Christmas time, he wanted to do something to help represent how he felt about the story of Christmas. And so he sat down and he began to write. And that beautiful Christmas hymn, O Little Town of Bethlehem, was written by Reverend Brooks. And every year when we sing that song, it is a wonderful reminder of a man who was simply trying to share the message that he felt represented Christmas. One of the saddest events in American history took place on December the 14th, 1799. It had actually began 2 days prior. George Washington, who a couple of years prior to that had retired out of being our first president, and he'd gone home fully believing that he was going to live out a very productive life. By this time, he is now 67 years old. He had gone out on the 12th and was riding those beautiful rounds around Mount Vernon, and it had been cold and wet and rainy, and he had come back, he'd gotten rained on, and there were people there that didn't quickly change clothes. And he chilled it down, and that night couldn't get warm. And they called in doctors, and he seemed to have a chest congestion problem and breathing problem. 2 doctors came. One is an elderly doctor, and that doctor wanted to cure Washington the same way everybody was cured. If you were sick, that meant you had too much blood, so that you had to be leeched. And they would cut you open, and they would attach a leech, and that leech would literally suck out your blood. And and it was thought that that was somehow going to magically make you better, which is absolute nonsense. The other doctor was a much younger man, and he had just recently come out of med school, and he said, no, we don't need to do that. That's not the problem. The problem is congestion. What we can do is we can perform a tracheotomy. We can cut open the windpipe and insert a straw down into the chest so that he can breathe. And the first doctor said, wait a minute, let me make sure that you understand what you just said. Your suggestion might work. If it doesn't work, you have just slit the throat of the father of our country. How long do you think you're going to live? And so they went ahead and leeched him, and Washington died later that day at the age of 67. And how incredibly, incredibly sad. On December the 15th, 1791, the Bill of Rights was ratified. The Bill of Rights had a very interesting historical background because it goes back to the Constitutional Convention where the Constitution was passed in 1787, and then Madison goes around to all the states to get the states to ratify so we can now change the form of government into the Constitution. And he gets to the state of New York, and New York says, we're not going to ratify. And Madison says, whoa, wait a minute, you've got to ratify. And they said, there is anything in the Constitution that guarantees any personal liberties. And Madison said, as a politician said, that's okay, they're all implied. And New York very wisely said, if it's not written down, there can come a time when the government can say it's not written down, so it doesn't exist. And then Madison wisely said, you are right. However, I need the Constitution ratified now, and if you will ratify now, I will bring you back a document that will guarantee everything you are asking for. And New York said, okay, because they knew Madison was an honorable man, and he was. And so Madison left with the signature that he needed. The Constitution gets ratified, and it becomes our form of government. And within a year and a half, Madison is back making the rounds again, getting the Bill of Rights ratified, and those Bill of Rights transform our country into the country where most people want to come to. And it's a wonderful document of freedom. Thank you, Mr. Madison. December the 16th, 1775, a little girl was born to a household. And that little girl grew up to absolutely capture hearts around the world. She lived to the age of 42. She died in 1817. She wrote primarily what we call 6 novels. Those 6 novels have been made into over 35 films and television series over the years, and Jane Austen still sells out all kinds of books and movies and on and on, and we don't know nearly enough about her. Why? Because 20 years after she died, just before her sister died, her sister burned over 300 letters that had been written between the 2 sisters, and it destroyed all the real evidence that we would have had and knowledge we would have had. But I always love the quote, there is no charm equal to the tenderness of heart. On December the 17th, 1903, 2 bicycle mechanics who had come down from Dayton, Ohio, to a windy knoll of land in the far northeastern corner of North Carolina. And they had been coming there for 3 years, and they had built little kites. They had started with kites, they had expanded them with wings, they had done all kinds of things. They had tried to get motors onto them, and they had tried to get Henry Ford to build him a motor, And he couldn't quite design it the way they needed it. They ended up designing it themselves. And on December the 17th, they finally got it airborne, and they finally flew it 180 feet. And what that did was transform our world. And we went from, in 1903, for the first time airborne in controlled flight, to 63 years later standing on the moon. Did these gentlemen impact our world? Oh my goodness, yes. December the 18th, 1916. This concluded what at that time it was the longest, bloodiest battle in world history. It was called the Battle of Verdun. It had been lasting virtually all the calendar year of 1916. And that battle ended up causing over 300,000 men to lose their lives. And it was just horrendous. And to give you an idea, there is a World War I cemetery in Verdun, France. It is one of 11 cemeteries in France dedicated only to World War I veterans, to give you an idea of the magnitude of World War I. On December the 19th, 1732, was the beginning of the publication of something that became known as Poor Richard's Almanac. A little boy had walked out of Boston at the age of 16 because he got upset with his brother, and he walked to Philadelphia. And then Benjamin Franklin began a life in Philadelphia, away from family, away from friends, and he only knew one thing, and that is he knew the printing business. And within a decade, he had not only started to work, he had bought the business. And by the early 1730s, he's looking for ways to make more money. And he started printing Poor Richard's Almanac. And in that almanac, you can read when to plant your crops, when to water your crops, to all kinds of things. But he also has wonderful little sayings. Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. And the sayings go on and on and on. And Benjamin Franklin was one of the truly great people that affected our world history. On December the 20th, 1860, South Carolina seceded from the Union. This is the first time it had ever happened in the United States. Did they have the right to do that? That's always been the debate. Why did they do this? Because an election had taken place. And you thought the elections in our lifetime have been brutal and ugly? Go back and read history. The 1860 election was so ugly that when you went, if you lived in the South, you couldn't vote for Abraham Lincoln. His name didn't appear on the ballot. If you voted for him, you had to write in his name, and then you would take the ballot up and hand it in. Oh, you voted for the wrong one. They would tear up the ballot and throw it away. You couldn't vote for Lincoln in the South because they were afraid he was going to get elected, and they were afraid he was going to try and take away slavery. He became what is known as a minority president. What that means is he got less than half the vote. Then how did he become president? Well, because there were 4 candidates in the 1860 election. There were Lincoln as the Republican candidate, Douglas as the Democratic candidate, and then 2 other men that ran Democratic Party splinter groups. Their names were Breckinridge and Bell, and they ended up becoming generals in the Confederate Army. Lincoln gets elected, and the South just had a coronary. And in December the 20th, South Carolina seceded. By the time Lincoln was inaugurated in March, 7 more states were seceded, and slowly, quickly after that, in that next month, 4 more did. And so that's when you get the split that creates the division of the Civil War of the North versus the South. It all began on December the 20th, 1860. December the 21st is the beginning of the winter solstice. Our solar system, our universe, is absolutely a work of genius. Our solar system is set up with the sun in the middle and planets that revolve around it. One of the planets is our planet Earth. It is the third in the line of succession of all the planets that go around the sun. Around our Earth is also a small little bitty piece of territory that we call our moon. And that moon sits at an angle, and then it rotates at an angle, and it goes around our Earth. And at that angle, it marks part of our calendar, so that at the winter solstice, the spring solstice, the summer solstice, the autumnal solstice, what we do is we get the divisions of seasons. And it's all about angles of the moon. And it's all about how the angle of the sun strikes the earth. And that's what causes the different seasons. And that's why at the equator, we have different reverse seasons than we do from the north and the southern hemisphere. It's because of the angles. And it begins, this winter solstice begins on December the 21st. On December the 22nd, 1783, something happened that might have been the most important thing that George Washington ever did, and most people have no idea what it was. We all honor George Washington as the father of our country, and rightly so. He was magnificent, and he set a precedence of how to conduct yourself in public, how to talk, how to act, how to listen, how to learn, how to move forward, how to lead a country with honor, and did a magnificent job. What he did on December the 22nd, 1783, might be even more important than all of that. The war had ended. And as the war had ended and all the documents were signed ending the war, and we were now at peace, what did he do? He went back to Congress, and this is the picture of it. He went back to Congress and resigned his military commission and gave the authority back to the government and said, I am no longer in charge of the military, firmly establishing the concept of civilian military control. Could have he not done that? Of course. Napoleon never walked away from that. Julius Caesar never walked away from that. Alexander the Great never walked away from that. And George Washington said, we are not going to trade one King George for another King George. And he walked away from all the power. And the military wanted him to keep it. And he said, no, that's not who we are, and that's not what we are about. And that was a magnificent sacrifice on his part. And he should be honored for such an event. On December the 23rd, 1913, this is kind of an interesting thing because America had elected a new president in November of 1912. And that new president brought together all kinds of interesting ideas and changes. One of the changes that was brought about was the creation of the Federal Reserve districts. And what they did, and as you can see there on the screen, the United States was divided into districts. And this is all about banking. And you will have one bank in charge of this whole giant district. And it will create money flow back and forth. And it will help make sure that as needed, there is money in different areas. And it's not a bad way to financially run the system of government financially. And because we had tried several different ideas. We tried the national banks, and we get the stories of Andrew Jackson overthrowing the national banks and all kinds of crazy stories. And so this has been an attempt to try and regulate money flow. And it has served the country well for over a century. December the 24th, 1745. There on the screen is a picture of a man by the name of Dr. Benjamin Rush. Dr. Benjamin Rush was a medical doctor in the Philadelphia area. He's one of the youngest men to sign the Declaration of Independence. He was also good friends with that entire generation. And Dr. Rush single-handedly took on the typhoid fever epidemic in the early 1790s in Philadelphia. And literally almost didn't sleep for weeks at a time, and caring for people all over and helping try and nurse them back to health. This man was phenomenal. He helped bring about a better understanding of medical health and care for people who have mental needs. He did all kinds of things that dramatically changed our world, and maybe the best thing that he ever did was that he began a letter-writing campaign in 1810 to former presidents Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, and kept telling them, gentlemen, the country needs you to be friends again. They had a falling out over the ugly election of 1800 and had completely fallen apart from each other. And Dr. Rush helped get them back together, and finally, in 1816, Mr. Jefferson wrote a letter to Mr. Adams and said, "Dear Mr. Adams, I want you to know that in spite of all of our difficulties, I always believed you were a patriot of our country." And Mr. Adams wrote back and said, "Dear Mr. Jefferson, my only regret is that I didn't write the letter first to you." And for the remaining decade of their lives, they stayed in contact, and they died on July 4th, 1826, on the 50th anniversary of our country. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, the second and third presidents, died on the 50th anniversary of our country. And the country acknowledged that was divine providence. And Benjamin Rush helped put that together and make that possible. And then Christmas Day. Christmas Day is celebrated all over the world as the birth of Jesus in a little bitty obscure town halfway around the world centuries ago. Why December the 25th? What is interesting is Christianity, after Jesus was crucified and moved on, and the apostles were sent out to various missionary places all over the world, some including Peter and Paul, end up in Rome. And the Catholic Church has always believed that since Peter was there, he helped bring about the beginning of the church there in Rome, and so he has been known as the father of Rome and the father of the church in Rome. And since the most members were there in Rome, that location grew, and it turned into what is now known as the Catholic Church. Well, it didn't take long for people to realize it all began with the birth of a little boy in what we call the Holy Land. And so, I don't know why it took so long, but eventually, one of the popes decided we need to figure out exactly the day. When was Jesus born? Well, by that time, the time they finally decided to go figure that out, it was 300 years after the fact. And not too many people kept very accurate medical birth records in stables. And so what they did is they went back and did all the research that they could possibly do, and they gave it a valiant effort. And they came up with what was probably about like a 10-day window. And they say, we're pretty sure it happened within this window. And the Pope says, well, what are we going to do? And one of them says, it's this day. And just randomly picked one. And so December the 25th got picked. Was there also a purpose to that? Probably, because there was also a very well-known pagan holiday on December the 25th, and Christianity is trying to appeal to a broad base of people, and so they were trying to include all kinds of things. And December the 25th got picked as the birthday of Jesus. Can we guarantee it was exactly that day? No, heavens no. Does it really matter? Not really. What matters is we're honoring the love of the Son, and we're also honoring the love of one another and helping us understand that we truly care one for another and we're trying to make a difference. December the 26th. That's kind of an interesting, crazy day. Because if you've lived outside the United States, if you've lived in countries that have had connection to England, and you can see countries that are highlighted there on the world map, these are the countries that still celebrate Boxing Day. And Boxing Day is December the 26th. Canada, United Kingdom, Nigeria, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand still celebrate the day after Christmas. It's called Boxing Day. Well, what the heck is Boxing Day? Today, it's usually viewed as the day you go back to stores and you trade and get the right size sweater, or whatever the gift you got and it doesn't quite work. And so it's always been kind of thought that. What really is it? The first real mention we have of Boxing Day is in the diaries of Samuel Pepys in the mid-1640s, and Samuel Pepys mentions that Boxing Day. It sounds like is when you worked in well-to-do homes, then on one day a year they would recognize the servant staff and they would give them a little box as a memento, and in that box was little gifts of sometimes food, sometimes money, sometimes clothing, any number of small thank you gifts. And so you would take that box home, and when people would see you walking around with your box on your way home, it was acknowledged, oh, someone thinks that you're a good person. Yes. And so it becomes kind of a cultural thing. But Boxing Day has always been kind of an interesting day. December the 27th, 1822, a man was born in central France. His name, Louis Pasteur. What he did was grew up to become a scientist and specifically a chemist. And what he did was create the concept of taking milk and heating it to a very high temperature under control, and what that did was that killed any imperfections in it, and then chilling it back down and selling milk. Great. Was that a big deal? Yes. What that process did was kill the concept that had been known as milk sickness. Was that a big deal? Yes. Ask Abraham Lincoln. His mother died of milk sickness when he was 9 years old. Milk sickness is when a cow goes out, and cows will eat anything, and a cow goes out walking all around and eats anything. And often they will eat something that becomes known as snake root. And snake root is poison. And when that cow eats it, and it becomes part of the processing inside the cow, what that does is that poisons the milk. And nobody knows that, of course. And so when you drink the milk, you have a very good possibility of at least getting sick and sometimes dying. And unfortunately, Lincoln's mother died of milk sickness. In the 1870s, Louis Pasteur created the concept that fixed it. And so we've never had a problem with milk since that time, because Pasteur created pasteurization. Thank you, Mr. Pasteur, for helping make our world a safer and better place to be. December 28th, 1856. There on the screen you can see a picture of President and Mrs. Woodrow Wilson. December 28, 1856 was actually Wilson's birthday. He was born in Stanton, Virginia, and in the home he grew up, his father was a minister. And so during the Civil War, opened their home as literally a medical care station. And lots of wounded soldiers came in and out of that home, and as a child, he saw this. And he grew up an avowed pacifist. He hated war. And then, when he was inaugurated, he said one of the greatest injustices would be if I ever had to have anything to do with the war. And he ended up being our president during World War I. And it was an incredible irony. It really, really was. December the 29th, 1170, way back in history. In 1170 in England, there was a very interesting event going on. And it involved two men, King Henry II and a man who was filling the position as the Archbishop of Canterbury. And this man's name was Thomas Becket. Becket and Henry had been friends. And Henry was one of the dynamic kings of English history. He really was. And Henry and Becket had been on his war council and helped him do all kinds of great things, helped him establish financially the security of England, and did some very good things. And then one day, the Archbishop died. Now, the Archbishop, what that means is that's the highest religious position in England. And Henry turned to Becket and said, you know, I know you've got a little bit of background in this sort of thing, and so I'm going to appoint you to this position. And I can run the country, and you can run the church, and we can get along fine, and everything is going to be wonderful. And Becket begged him not to do that. Please do not do that. Oh no, it'll work out fine, everything's good, and we'll get along, it's okay. And so Henry went ahead and appointed Thomas Becket to become the religious leader of England. And Becket turned into a religious leader of England, a very serious-minded person who stood up for the church and let Henry know when he thought Henry was doing wrong. And that was not something Henry ever expected to see. And then a couple of days after Christmas, in 1170, Henry, in the leftover of Christmas dinners, one day was ranting and raving and complaining, and said, "Won't anyone rid me of this meddlesome priest?" And so what happened is some of Henry's guards got on their horses and rode down to that southeast corner of England from London to Canterbury. And they went in that gigantic Canterbury Cathedral, and there they found Thomas Becket kneeling in prayer. And they went up to him and took out their swords and killed him in his church, kneeling in prayer. Now, the church then was Catholic. And so you can imagine how the Pope reacted to that. As well he should have. And threatened to excommunicate not only Henry, excommunicate the entire country. And what that means is, that means that no births are sanctioned, no marriages are sanctioned, no deaths are sanctioned, which means if you die, you're automatically going to hell. And the country went nuts, as well they should. And Henry ended up begging forgiveness and ended up having to, he rode to Canterbury, and then the last 3 miles had to get down on his knees and crawl to the church, and got into Canterbury Church Cathedral, and there prayed and begged for forgiveness before the Pope would forgive him and unexcommunicate Henry and the country. And Thomas Becket was put on on the fast track to sainthood and became Saint Thomas à Becket. But it is a phenomenal story. It really is. And there was a wonderful movie in 1968 called Becket. And it had Peter O'Toole as King Henry II and Richard Burton as Thomas Becket. And it is phenomenal. It really, really is. December the 30th, 1865, a little boy was born in central England next to a giant lake. And his parents loved that lake. That lake was called Rudyard Lake. And so the parents took that name of the lake and gave it to their son, and he became Rudyard Kipling. And Rudyard Kipling and his family, while he was still a child, went to India, and he grew up in India. And his writings are phenomenal. The Just So stories, and Kim, and on and on and on. And the story of Mowgli. And he writes wonderful things, and he writes wonderful poetry, the Barrack Ballads poetry. And in my opinion, this is my favorite of all of Kipling's poetry. Now in Inchi's sunny clime, where I used to spend my time, a servant of Her Majesty the Queen, of all them black-faced crew, the finest man I knew was a regimental Bishi, Gunga Din. And he just talks about the colloquialism of England, of India, and the message. And he calls Gunga Din the finest man I knew. Gunga Din was a member of the lowest form of society. And Gunga Din would come and follow the English troops around and help them and serve them. And Kipling doesn't say he's just a good man. He says he's the finest man I knew. And it helps you understand determination of character has nothing to do with color, has nothing to do with social status. It has everything to do with who we are and how we treat people. And you go back and you read Gunga Din, and then you'll begin to understand that we are missing the point of character until you read what Gunga Din has to say. On December the 31st, 1880, this man was born. This is General George C. Marshall. General Marshall was called by Sir Winston Churchill the architect of war and the architect of peace. General Marshall was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff through virtually all of the Roosevelt years of the presidency, and he handpicked leaders all over, including picking Dwight D. Eisenhower to run Operation Overlord. And then that's when Roosevelt appointed him. General Marshall ended up also serving in the Truman eras as the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense. He's the only man in American history that has held all three of those positions. General Marshall created the Marshall Plan that brought Europe back from World War II. If we have things to be proud of about the accomplishments of World War II, Marshall is in the center of all of that. He is a fantastic human being who has never been given enough credit for what he did. And he made our modern world possible. And of course, December 31st is New Year's Eve. In the Gregorian calendar, this is where we end the year, and we promise ourselves that next year will be better. And we promise ourselves that we are going to do so much better. And boy, aren't we looking forward to 2021, hoping that all good things will happen in 2021, because 2020 has sure been quite a year that we sure did not see coming. And we're hoping for much better in 2021. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here and hearing about the events of December and beginning to understand how important those events are in American and even in world history. And I appreciate your time. Thank you.